kind discussions? Okay. Meeting is being recorded. So I think after we'll just go through the three presentations, and maybe we can stop after each one to get questions on that particular presentation, if that sounds all right to everyone.
Yeah, the other thing, let me check this other thing. I was able to read Thomas's paper, and because we didn't really assign discussants or anything.
Right.
And I read Thomas's paper, and then the person who's not here, I read their paper, and I sort of was prepared to ask some questions and make some comments about both of those. But I guess we'll handle that as it comes. But am I right in assuming it also means that I can go a little slower through my own presentation, because we should each have plenty of time?
Yeah, we have only three presenters. So I think, I don't think, as long as we're all reasonable about it, there's no reason to have any strict timekeeping or anything like that.
Okay. Yeah, I think.
But I mean, maybe on that note, I think
about 20 minutes.
Sorry?
But if I go to 25.
Yeah, 25 would be fine, I think.
Okay.
So I mean, I don't know. Your slides are up, and it's 5 minutes after the start time, and we've got a couple people here to listen. So I don't know if you want to just get started. Would you like to just get started, and you can go first?
Sure.
All right.
Why not?
So as long as it's up there, why go through taking it down and putting someone else up, right?
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you everyone for coming, and we see the slide up there that of the first presenter here. So I think whenever you're ready, you can just get started.
Okay. So this is a paper that's been submitted to the Review of Radical Political Economics and been provisionally accepted. So what I'm doing is presenting the main features of that. There's a few things that I've left out just because you can't cover everything. But the question I'm sort of addressing in a very tentative way, I'm essentially saying at some point in time, we're going to face the situation where people in some country who have launched something along the lines of the socialist economy are going to have to figure out how they interact with the economies in the rest of the world. And so I think the challenge, the wrong way to view it is that the challenge is, what should a country which has rejected capitalism and is beginning to build a socialist economy do with regards to international trade and investment? But in today's world, where presumably other countries will have capitalist economies still, and where there are still going to be very large differences in levels of economic development, no matter what kind of system any particular country is using. So this paper really is just intended to stimulate discussion and explore what I think are dilemmas that such a country will face. And then I am admittedly rather boldly proposing some concrete answers, to that makes some sense to me, that I propose them in the spirit that these are dilemmas that any such country will face. So let's have a conversation about it. But to make the conversation sort of concrete and productive, what I've done in this paper is suggest some rules that such a country might follow when it's trying to take advantage of opportunities which international trade and investment provide, but it's also trying to avoid undermining fundamental principles that are the backbone of any socialist economy. Context. Fortunately for present purposes, I don't think we need to delve deeply into the weeds of what is meant by a socialist economy. I mean, there's huge debates about what would a socialist economy be? What is 21st century socialism? And I think that fortunately, the questions I'm addressing in this paper needn't worry about which particular form of 21st century socialism we might be talking about. I think as long as the country seeks to be guided in some way or another by the following two principles, then the discussion is relevant. Workers should manage themselves rather than be managed by others. And in some way, people's efforts, sacrifices, and needs should affect how income is distributed. So what I'm proposing is that for any country with an economy that in some way subscribes to those two principles, then these are the dilemmas it would face, and these are some proposals for what it might do in response. I can skip that advertisement for my own particular version of the socialist economy. Here's the easy part. I think that direct foreign investment is basically out of bounds for any country that subscribes to those two principles. And that's because direct foreign investment is incompatible with worker self-management. So direct foreign investment by foreign companies in the socialist economy can't be permitted because it would turn workers in the socialist economy into employees. In this case, employees of foreign owners, which would rob them of their right to self-management. While workers in a socialist economy may encourage and even help establish worker cooperatives in other countries, the principle of economic self-management also does not allow those in a socialist economy to own and operate businesses abroad, because that would make foreign workers employees and rob them of their right to self-management. So I think that's actually the easy part. Direct foreign investment is just not something that a country that is aspiring to some sort of socialist economy can engage in. But that's not true either for international trade or international financial investment. Differences in opportunity costs of production among countries create opportunities for countries to benefit from specializing in the production and export of goods in which they enjoy a comparative advantage, and importing in exchange goods in which trading partners have a comparative advantage. So naturally, like any other country, a country with a socialist economy will want to take advantage of these opportunities. However, that logic takes into account only the short-run effects of international trade. All countries seek to increase their economic productivity, and the pace of productivity-enhancing technological change often varies considerably among industries. In other words, not all comparative advantages are created equal. Moreover, by pursuing strategic trade policies over time, a country can change its comparative advantages to become more advantageous, rather than merely accept whatever its historic comparative advantages happen to be as some sort of fait accompli. So like any country, a country with a socialist economy should be guided both by these short-run and long-run goals regarding its own self-interest when trading with other countries. However, pursuing static efficiency gains by continuing to specialize in today's comparative advantages may prevent changes that would increase productivity a great deal more, and therefore come at the expense of what we might loosely call dynamic efficiency. But this has long been the subject of debates over strategic trade policy. The hallmark of the Asian development model, pioneered after World War II by Japan and later imitated with great success by South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and most recently China, is that these countries did not accept their comparative advantages as a fait accompli. Instead, they aggressively pursued policies to create new comparative advantages in industries where it would be easier to achieve larger productivity increases. So in my view, like any country, a country with a socialist economy will want to take both static and dynamic efficiency into account when engaging in international trade. But here is where our sort of particular dilemma arises. What does it mean to be a country that has a moral compass? How should a country with a socialist economy seek to share efficiency gains with trading partners? And when a country with a socialist economy pursues strategic policies to create more advantageous comparative advantage for itself, how should it take its level of economic development relative to its trading partners into account? For countries with economies lacking any moral compass, these questions never arise. For such countries, the answers are simply always strive to capture as large a share of any efficiency gained from international trade as you can for yourself. Always seek to build new comparative advantages in industries with the highest rate of productivity increase. But a fundamental principle of a socialist economy is that people should be rewarded according to their efforts, sacrifices, and needs. And I think this is the key point. I don't think a country with a socialist economy can drop this moral principle at its borders. Not only because it would be wrong to do so, but also because embracing the doctrine of dog eat dog in international economic relations would undermine a fundamental moral principle that undergirds its own economic system. Basically, I would argue that adopting that approach would come back to haunt them. It would, in some ways, important ways, undermine their whole project for what they're trying to create. So here are the rules that I would propose for discussion that I think any such economy should adopt. The first rule, I'm not going to talk too much about, but I do want to make sure that it's in there. First rule number one is there must be efficiency gains. A country with a socialist economy should engage in international trade when, but only when, doing so produces global efficiency gains. Rule number one prevents a country with a socialist economy from participating in international divisions of labor which are actually counterproductive and likely contrary to its own self-interest. This rule is actually standard economic trade theory, even if seldom understood or taught. But here are the rules that I think are more important for us to discuss for sort of, that pertain in particular to a country with a socialist economy. So rule number two, the more than 50% rule. When a country with a socialist economy negotiates terms of trade, more than 50% of any efficiency gain should go to whichever country is less economically developed. This second rule ensures that when a country with a socialist economy engages in what is mutually beneficial international trade, it will be reinforcing rather than undermining a fundamental moral principle that undergirds its own economic system, namely that economic justice requires the people to be paid according to their efforts and sacrifices. Rule number 2A, when a country with a socialist economy negotiates interest rates on international loans, more than 50% of any efficiency gain should go to whichever country is less developed. This third rule is the one that's actually, I think, more complicated to apply. And I'm going to spend more time sort of talking about how a country could apply rule number 3. Climbing the ladder of comparative advantage. When considering strategic trade policies to change comparative advantages over time, a country with a socialist economy should take into account its level of economic development compared to its trading partners. This third rule, I believe, is also necessary to prevent a country with a socialist economy from violating its commitment to economic justice while seeking to shift production to industries where productivity increases are greater within its own economy. Well, the question then is, well, how can a country with a socialist economy go about applying these rules? Well, first, what's got to be decided? Participatory annual planning. Now, at this point, I have to sort of use some particular model of a socialist economy. So in the model that I favor, which is the model known as a participatory economy, annual planning will decide what a country with a participatory socialist economy exports and imports during a year, given its current comparative advantages, which I explain in the article. That's that's part of what I sent in as a submission for this panel. And this can be done by imposing a balance of trade constraints and fixing the prices, the indicative prices of tradables at their international prices, while adjusting prices of non-tradables to equate domestic demand and supply during that annual participatory planning process. So that's part of the paper, and it's kind of technical, and I'm not trying to present it here verbally. But the problem is that does not address the context in which those annual decisions will be made during participatory annual planning. Will subsidies have helped an industry achieve a comparative advantage so the annual plan will call for exporting its products? Will tariffs have helped protect promising infant industries until such time as they can compete openly during annual planning? Basically, how will a socialist economy discover the efficient trade-off between static and dynamic efficiency, and how will it follow rule number 3 as well? How much technical change increases labor productivity in the industry where the change takes place is not the same as how much it increases productivity in the economy as a whole. If a product where productivity increases does not enter in the production of other commodities, technically, if it's not basic, it won't impact productivity broadly. On the other hand, if a commodity enters into the production of many other goods, i.e. it's basic, it will increase productivity in the economy as a whole much more. Now, fortunately, I proved a theorem in income distribution and environmental sustainability published back in 2017 that allows us to calculate how much technical change introduced in any industry increases overall labor productivity in the economy. I'm not going to read the part below that basically says this is the actual formula, this is how you do the calculation. But at least in theory, this theorem allows us to evaluate how much technical changes in a particular industry increase overall economic productivity. What this allows us to do, for example, is we can go back over 10 years and perform this calculation for each industry for each year, and then calculate the average increase in overall economic productivity in the economy due to technical changes in each industry over the previous 10 years. Presumably, we would discover that technical changes in some industries had increased overall productivity more than the technical changes in other industries. And while past performance is not a perfect predictor of future performance, nonetheless, these calculations of historic differences in how much technical change in different industries had increased overall productivity would provide a useful guide to rank industries, indicating in which industries it would be more or less advantageous to have a comparative advantage. This information could then be used to guide strategic trade policy to best serve the self-interest of the country. This actually applies to any country, whether it has a moral compass or it does not. But you could also do this in order to compare and rank countries with regard to how advantageous their actual comparative advantages are. And depending on where a country with a socialist economy fell in such an international ranking of countries, it would know how to apply rule number 3. That is, how aggressive or restrained it was fair for it to be in seeking to upgrade its comparative advantages. Now, you could argue that only the least developed countries be permitted to engage in strategic trade policies, to build new comparative advantages in what the Japanese Ministry of Trade and Industry once called the industries of the future, until the least developed country had caught up completely with the more developed countries. But as in the case of the more than 50% rule, instead of a 100% rule for setting terms of trade, for practical reasons, I recommend a less strict version of rule number 3 and suggest that countries with socialist economies can remain true to their principle of economic justice so long as they engage in strategic trade policies which make material progress in overcoming differences in economic development among their trading partners. Well, how do you actually go about doing it? Calculating the optimal size of tariffs and subsidies basically reduces to estimating the magnitudes of deadweight losses compared to producer surpluses to ensure that gains in dynamic efficiency outweigh losses in static efficiency. Who better to estimate the magnitude of deadweight losses for consumers than a national federation of consumers? When benefits are concentrated and costs are diffuse, the logic of political lobbying favors those for whom there is much at stake, as Mansur Olson pointed out long ago. Putting the National Federation of Consumers in charge of estimating deadweight losses empowers the group for whom effects are most diffuse and who therefore have most often had too little impact historically on trade policy. Who better to argue the case for policies to advantage their industry than different industry federations of producers? Now, to be successful, claims for favorable treatment will have to be backed up by evidence about how an industry's contribution to overall productivity increases has compared historically to others. So those are my suggestions about who should be tasked with estimating the things you have to estimate in order to calculate, a strategic trade policy. I think armed with these estimates of deadweight losses and future producer surpluses, which emerge from a dialogue between the National Consumer Federation and the different industry federations, a Ministry for International Trade can be tasked with proposing tariffs and subsidies for different industries, including a schedule for their removal. And that should be debated and approved either by the national legislature or a national referendum, taking into account where the country ranks compared to its trading partners. That's what I argue a socialist country would have to do, that a capitalist country that has no moral compass would not do. Finally, as results from annual plans reveal errors in estimations of deadweight losses and producer surpluses, I explain in the lengthy version of the article how there will be opportunities for the Ministry for International Trade to make adjustments to mitigate welfare losses, which also should be approved by a national legislature or referendum. So here are my conclusions. Let me summarize. What the article argues is, first, a country which honors the principle of worker self-management cannot engage in direct foreign investment abroad or permit direct foreign investment in its own economy. Second, a country which honors the principle that everyone deserves to be compensated based on his or her efforts, sacrifices, and needs should agree to terms of trade as well as interest rates on international loans, which distribute more than 50% of efficiency gains to whichever country is less developed. A socialist economy using the annual iterative planning procedure that's part of the model that's known as a participatory economy will be guided to benefit from exporting goods in which it enjoys a comparative advantage and importing goods in which it does not, simply by fixing the prices of tradables at their international levels and imposing a balance of trade constraint during the annual participatory planning procedure. A national consumer federation and industry federations, it seems to me, are well suited to debate and agree on estimates of the short-run costs and long-run benefits of tariffs and subsidies, which then a Ministry for International Trade can use to design an appropriate set of strategic trade policies. These policies can then be subject to approval by the national legislature or national referendum. And in the case of a country with a socialist economy, that approval process should take into account how that country's comparative advantages rank relative to its trading partners. So thank you. That takes, I don't know if I went over my time or didn't, but okay, good. I got in under the bell.
Yeah, no, definitely not over your time. So I think maybe now we'll excuse me. Now we'll take any questions. I mean, it's a relatively small group, so I think whoever people want to do it is fine. You might need my permission to talk if you're not one of the panelists, but I think if people either can say something in the chat or raise their hand, and I'll let you talk. Well, maybe I'll ask one question first while others are thinking about it. So one question that occurred to me is, the title of the paper is "When Socialism Comes One Country at a Time." I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how some of these trading rules might work when there's other countries at maybe similar levels of economic development that are not following these rules. So I was thinking about, for example, the rejection of FDI, or this rule about 50% of the gains having to go to the less developed country. And how does that look when one country is trying to implement those rules? Is there a danger that they could sort of be outcompeted in a way that's damaging to their economy by countries that are not following those rules?
That's a really good question. In the paper, I actually consider sort of an extra level of an extra complication, which is some countries. So we have this country that has a socialist economy, and it can be trading or engaging in international financial investment with other countries that are capitalist countries that basically have no moral compass, or with other countries that also, there might be another country that it would trade with that has a socialist economy. So you have to tackle, how does a socialist economy interact with other socialist economies? How does a socialist economy interact with capitalist economies? And then whether it's a socialist or capitalist economy you're interacting with, it may be more or less developed than you are. And I actually came to the conclusion that a socialist economy only really has to take into account whether the other economy is more or less developed. That's basically what having a moral compass amounts to. Now, the assumption always is that when two countries engage in international trade, there's a mutual benefit. And therefore, it's really simply a question of how that mutual benefit is being distributed. So when I say that a socialist country should agree to terms of trade with a less developed country that assign, let's say, 70% of the efficiency gain to that country, that doesn't mean the socialist country is not benefiting from international trade. It's simply only getting 30% of the efficiency gain. It's agreeing to do that because that is what's fair according to its own principles. Now, does that mean that cutthroat capitalist economies, when they engage in international trade, do they have an advantage? Yes, they have an advantage if they simply take maximum advantage of their bargaining power over the terms of trade. So essentially, a capitalist economy could take advantage of a less developed economy in its international trade. And what I'm arguing is that a socialist economy, it would be violating and undermining its own basic principles to take advantage of a less developed economy. So does that in some sense impose a handicap on socialist economies? Yeah, the handicap is you can't take advantage of less developed economies the way the capitalist economies do. And so in that sense, it might be not, it quite literally would not be, it would not be benefiting itself sometimes to the extent that it conceivably could, if it did not, if you want to think of it as shackle itself with this moral constraint principle. But I don't think, I think the important thing is, if you go back in time, and this I talk about in the article also, when the Russian Revolution took place, socialists basically assumed there was going to be a world revolution. But at some point in the 20th century, it became apparent, and I think it's increasingly apparent in the 21st century, that if we have countries that adopt socialist economies, this is not going to happen all at once. So we are going to have to deal with this dilemma. Socialist countries that are adopting socialist economies, including the Chilean government right now. Countries that where socialist-minded people come to power in countries, they're going to be living in a world where most of the other economies in the world are capitalist, and there are huge differences in levels of economic development. So they're going to have to grapple with the problem of how do you deal with these fundamental aspects of international economics. And that's what I'm simply trying to sort of ignite a debate about in the paper.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from any of the other attendees? All right, Tom, do you prefer to go second or third? All right, I'll go first. I'll go now then. I might as well just go. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was muted, right?
Yeah.
You want me to go?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
I'm just trying to find my share screen button. There it is. And can everybody see those? my slides? You are
Yeah.
screen sharing.
Very
Yep, looks good.
Okay, I'm going to go with full screen. So this is a paper that Daniela and I wrote. We wrote it in the middle of the COVID epidemic when it first started, and it sort of has evolved since then. I think Danielle is in the audience, and he may have a few comments later on, but I'm going to do the presentation. Basic overview is that we were impressed by a technical progress function that Lance Taylor, Duncan Foley, and Armin Rezai used in their Cambridge Journal article. It's basically just an equation that captures two of the main themes that you find in structuralist economics, which is first, economies of scale, the so-called Kaldor-Verdurn law, which is very well supported empirically. And second, the idea that technical change is guided by distribution. So another thing about that function that we liked was that it supports the property of path dependence. That is, formally, the model has a zero root, which means it doesn't have a unique equilibrium. It has multiple equilibriums. So shocks, temporary shocks even, cause almost everything to change in the long run. But the Taylor Foley-Rezai paper was basically situated in a kind of a neo-Kaleckian model, the kind that Lance Taylor is known for. We thought it would be appropriate to embed it in a kind of a classical model, like the classical models that we feature in our book, Growth and Distribution. So features of that, Say's law, we don't distinguish between investment and saving. The system is at normal utilization. So it's a supply side model, and it's a class structure. So accumulation is guided by the Cambridge equation that links the profit rate to the growth rate. In order to embed the TFR technical progress function, we had to add an auxiliary equation that basically describes the bias of technical change in terms of whether it's capital using or labor saving. So we find that Marx bias technical change, that is capital using labor saving technical change, plays a key role in sort of the regulating the system and stabilizing it. We closed the model with an endogenous rate of population growth and endogenous distribution, but we kept that flexible so that we could also consider either one or both of those being exogenous. The models in our book, Growth and Distribution, are at the extremes. There's either no labor constraint at all, or the labor constraint is binding. There's a purely exogenous natural rate of growth. So we're looking at sort of the middle ground there. I think one interesting feature of the paper or the model is that it provides every answer to the Herod question that has been offered. The Herod question is, how does a capitalist economy coordinate the growth rate with some kind of natural rate of growth of population and technical change? So this model actually uses each of the answers that have been provided. The Solo answer, for example, says that the output to capital ratio changes due to, for Solo, it was movement along a production function, but we don't have a production function. I think we have a much more attractive way of modeling technology. The Kaldor explanation or answer is that distribution adjusts, so that if the growth rate is too low, the profit share goes up, and you get the idea. And Marx basically argues that the natural rate adapts to the actual rate of accumulation through, the reserve army of labor, or possibly through endogenous distribution-led technical change. So the main results we get in the paper, first of all, is that we clarify the conditions under which wage-led growth occurs. And here, by wage-led growth, I mean the rate of accumulation is led by the wage share, and not for demand reasons, as in a neo-Kaleckian model, but because of the effect of distribution on technical change. The second thing is we interpret neoliberal stagnation through the lens of the model. And the third application is that we apply it to shocks like the COVID shock. And at the time that we wrote the paper, we were enthusiastic about that aspect of the paper. But as the COVID epidemic has proceeded, I'm less enthusiastic about what we say about COVID. So I'm going to focus on the stagnation part and the clarifying wage-led growth. So here's the model. So I'm giving you the roster of Greek letters at the top, and I think everything here is going to be pretty familiar to people. The first equation, the Cambridge equation, just links up the rate of profit, which is the profit share pi times rho, which is output capital ratio. And beta is the propensity to consume out of wealth. So 1 minus beta would be something like, we don't like to call it the saving rate, we call it the capitalization rate, because it's a combination of saving and investment. The second equation is the TFR, technical progress function, that I started the paper with. Kappa is the capital to population, not capital labor, capital to population ratio. And the hat indicates the growth rate. So that term with kappa in it captures the Verdurn, the Kaldor-Verdurn dynamic economies of scale effect. And the final term captures the idea that an increase in the wage share incentivizes labor-saving innovation, so that when the profit share goes down, pi is the profit share, it increases the rate of technical change. And gamma on the left-hand side is, of course, the rate of labor productivity growth. And then the third equation is the auxiliary equation that I mentioned earlier, where chi is the rate of capital saving technical change. So a negative chi would represent capital using or Marx biased technical change. And here, E is the employment rate. So we've linked up the bias of technical change to the state of the labor market, with the idea being that when the labor market tightens up, when the employment rate grows, it incentivizes firms to look more aggressively for innovations. And as they do that, they're going to be more likely to use more mechanization and automation. So you get a negative effect from an increase in employment on the capital using bias of technical change. The final two equations are the closures. We make population growth depend on the employment rate. And of course, it can't be greater than 1, so we have to use that min function, which, but this also leaves open the option that population growth can be exogenous, in which case it would just be equal to n bar, which is the exogenous aspect of it. And finally, distribution is inversely related to the employment rate through some kind of reserve army effect or a Goodwin effect. And once again, you can see that you could make distribution exogenous by just making it equal to pi bar. So with those closures, that gives us 4 possible kind of special cases, depending on whether population growth and or distribution are endogenous or exogenous. So I'm going to start with the kind of simplest model in which both population growth and distribution are exogenous, because that is a very good way to bring out the logic of wage-led growth. And then I'm going to go to the general case where both population growth and distribution are endogenous. So here's a picture that shows how an increase in the profit share can generate wage-led growth. We're looking at the technical progress function, showing how kappa, the growth of kappa, drives labor-saving technical change, and we're looking at an increase in the profit share, which shifts the technical progress function down. The 45-degree line represents the steady state of the model. So what you see happening initially, in the short run, going from A to B is that the fact that accumulation is profit-led through the Cambridge equation puts the system into a period of high growth. And you go from A to B and you get a short-run profit-led growth. But then this bias of technical change, the capital using bias of technical change kicks in, and you get a period of Marx-biased technical change, which lowers the rate of profit, and through the Cambridge equation, moves the system to a point like C, which is the new steady state. So at the end of the day, you've had an increase in the profit share, which has reduced growth, which is the signature of wage-led growth. So that illustrates the basic logic. Now I'm going to go to the sort of the general results. And here we have all the signs of the comparative equilibria. I'm not going to go through them all, but I just want to point out a couple of features. All of them, except for one, are either positive or have one sign, or they could be zero. But the one that's highlighted in red, which is the relationship between the growth rate and the profit share, can be either positive or negative. In other words, you can have either profit-led or wage-led growth. So I'm going to zoom in on that particular cell. But before I do, let me just point out a couple of features. One is that the bottom line shows the effects of a temporary shock, in this case to capital productivity. And the rest of the derivatives indicate permanent changes in parameters. And I'm going to go through actually the next to the last line there, which is the capitalization rate, because I think that's part of the story of stagnation under neoliberal capitalism. So let me zoom in on that cell that had the different signs, and this is sort of clarifying the conditions under which you get wage-led growth. What you can see is these are the four possible cases, and it's clear that exogenous labor supply is a sufficient condition for wage-led growth. You can see that from the left-hand column, that both those signs are negative, which means that when the profit share goes up, you get lower growth, which is the signature of wage-led growth. An endogenous labor supply turns out to be a necessary condition for profit-led growth. So what this means to us is that it sort of clarifies the conditions under which you get a much more classical kind of profit-led system and the conditions under which you get wage-led growth, which I think that's useful. And especially as we're moving forward into a period when labor constraints on growth may become more important, I think this might be significant in practice. But let me turn to a scenario in which you increase the capitalization rate, because I want to illustrate how that would affect the system. Actually, in this case, we're decreasing the capitalization rate. I'm sorry, because I want to relate this to the stagnation question. So if you look at the upper right-hand graph, that's the log of the capital stock, and what you see is you get lower growth. It's a log, so the slope of it indicates the growth rate, and the dotted line is the reference path before the change. The mechanism is, go down to the lower left column, you can see that the employment rate has fallen because you have lower growth. And what that does is it affects distribution. Employment rate falls, workers are in a weaker bargaining position, the profit share goes up. And so consequently, you move over to the lower right graph, you can see that this has caused productivity growth to go down through the distribution effects. And meanwhile, the transition process, if you look at the upper left-hand corner, the transition process involves the opposite of Marx bias technical change, which is capital saving technical change, which raises the output to capital ratio. So we think this is part of the story of of stagnation under neoliberal capitalism. So I want to turn to some data. I want to look at two alternative stories, interpreting the world through this model, not trying to do an exhaustive, comparison between different stories. The first story is a supply side story, which would be similar in the mainstream to what Robert Gordon has been arguing, that stagnation is caused by exogenous factors, slower population, slower technical, we're running out of ideas and that sort of thing. The alternative hypothesis is we call it structuralist, and it's the idea that the institutions of neoliberal capitalism themselves are responsible for stagnation. And we single out two in particular. One is the resurgent power of capital and the rising profit share. And the second is the lower investment and saving rate under neoliberal capitalism. And we think those are a reflection of the basic institutional changes of the last 3 or 4 decades. So here are some data which, informs this, horse race between two alternative stories. And I think it supports the structuralist hypothesis. In particular, the rising profit share and the decline in the employment rate they contradict the supply side story. The supply side story says, look, if population growth goes down, workers should be in a stronger bargaining position, and they should be able to increase the wage share. And that pretty much clearly has not happened. We've periodized, but the key column to look at is the final column, which shows the change between the early period of neoliberalism, 1980 to about 2000, and the last 20 years, 2000 to, it's 2018. And what you can see is that there's clearly been a pattern that is consistent with the structuralist hypothesis: decline in the employment rate, increase in capital productivity, decline in the wage share, or an increase in the profit share. And the final two rows show what's happened to the capitalization rate. Here, S is actually the flow version of the capitalization rate, which would be investment as a share of profits, as opposed to propensity to save out of wealth. And in both cases, you can see that it's gone down, which is consistent with our basic structuralist hypothesis. I think there's a significant political point I want to make here, which is that this suggests that neoliberal capitalism is to a substantial extent dependent on rentier consumption, an increase in the consumption of the rentier or capitalist class. So conclusions, first, wage-led growth is strengthened by labor constraints. Profit-led growth depends on a high elasticity of labor force growth. The second main conclusion is that secular stagnation seems to have resulted from this combination of a resurgent power of capital and a reduced propensity for capitalists to save and invest. So a question I have often asked is, if capitalism is profit-led, why with all the increase in profitability out there, why don't we see more growth? And here we see an answer to that question, which is that you've got a system which offers profits without growth. Slower productivity growth and population growth are more a consequence of stagnation than they are a cause interpreted through this model. A final point is, and that relates to what I said earlier about the COVID shock, is that the model exhibits path dependence, so that if you have a temporary shock, it'll have a permanent effect. And we model the COVID shock as a temporary decline in capital productivity and show that it's going to have some long-term negative supply consequences. I'm not sure that that's right, because I think the COVID shock is turning out to be a lot more complicated than anybody thought. I mean, we hadn't really anticipated some of the things that have happened. including the great what do they call it now, the Great Resignation, in terms of workers quitting jobs. So the other thing we can't take into account in the model is the fiscal response, which at least in the United States has been, I think, quite good. And so I think a complete account of the COVID shock is going to have to involve a model that goes beyond this model. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't. Did you say, Daniela? Did you want to make some commentary here as well? All right, good. You do. So let's see if that works. You should be able to unmute yourself and talk now, I think.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Tom, for a great presentation. Thanks, everybody, for listening. I just wanted to speak very quickly about the COVID point that Tom made. While it's true that our enthusiasm about the ability of the paper to speak to the COVID shock has waned off a little bit, the one thing that Tom pointed out that is really important is that, you know, there is no clear counterfactual where there's a country in the world that didn't do anything to combat COVID through a fiscal stimulus. So we don't have that. And the model is actually, there's no fiscal policy. So the path dependence arises like quite forcefully because of that. But we have an interesting comparison, I think, into the degrees of fiscal response between the United States and Europe. And it seems to me that the fiscal response in Europe has been, you know, important, but not as important as the United States. And the recovery, I think this is showing in the recovery. So in a way, there's a point to be explored further there, in the sense that it seems that those path dependencies that have characterized the aftermath of the 2008 recession in the United States and in the global economy, those forces are still at play. So that's all I have, actually. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Robin, you said that you had taken a look at this paper previously. Did you want to share some thoughts as well?
Yeah, it's mostly a question. And let me preface this by saying that my familiarity with structuralist macro theory is both limited and I have not kept up with the literature recently. So, I mean, I was very familiar with sort of the early work of Margolin and Dutt, Taylor and Tom Palley, but the way I stayed involved in that was principally because Robert Blecker at American University would take a sabbatical, and then I would take over his graduate class where he taught that. So when he took sabbaticals, I would become re-familiar with the literature, but it's been a while since I've done that. But what I'm curious about is that I don't know what you call the model, but it's sort of a Keynesian. If you combine a Keynesian approach to investment theory with a Kalecki sort of approach or a Marxist approach to wage determination, you get something. Then you take the basic structuralist framework, and when you put those things into it, you can get a stagnation. You can get an explanation for stagnation. So what I'm curious about is this. It seems to me, Tom, that you are offering us to some degree, it's an alternative explanation for the stagnation outcome of neoliberalism of the last roughly 40 years. And I understand that the first 20 years and the second 20 years of the last 40 years might be somewhat different, and those differences can be important. But as long as, you know, capitalists invest more when the profit rate is higher, and also invest less when there is more idle capacity, and therefore presumably less need, you know, for more capital. And as long as capitalist saving rate is higher than workers' saving rate out of income, and then if you have any sort of bargaining power theory of wage determination, that is sufficient to give you an explanation for what is sort of the lose-lose outcome, in which both capitalists and workers lose, and the present generation and future generations lose. And so we had that at some point in time, and it seems to me that what your paper is doing is giving us an alternative explanation. But that's my question is, to what extent do you see it as an alternative explanation that is consistent with, the historical outcome? And to what extent do you see it as sort of an elaboration or refinement of that basic sort of stagnation explanation that we had, back a while ago?
Okay, am I on? Yeah, that's a really deep question. Actually, I think you're asking to resolve the ongoing, I guess, debate between the more Keynesian structuralist economists and the more classical structuralist economists. This model, the assumption is that in the long run, the system is at normal or full capacity. So it doesn't have those Keynesian properties you get from the Neo-Kaleckian closure. I think it's not that we're like dogmatically in favor of this. I mean, we're basically assuming something like Say's law because we think we want to describe a system over a very long time period, like a generational period. And I think at that low frequency, this model is fit for purpose for dealing with kind of the supply side of capitalism. So that really is a fundamental difference between the Neo-Kaleckian models that Taylor and others use and Robert Blecker. And I think one interesting thing is that there's now a kind of convergence in that the people who work with the Lance Taylor type models are also interested in the idea that technical change itself can be wage-led, and that's a part of our understanding of modern of capitalism. So I guess my answer to your question is this debate will probably be going on for a lot longer. Daniela, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, at this point about technical change, I just put in a funny observation in the chat. Like this is my PhD dissertation, 13 years ago. It took me 13 years to convince the Neo-Kalecki the technical change is important, and it's the distribution features are important. So I'm glad that they're coming along.
Can I have a brief follow-up question? Which is, so some of the old versions, like actually the simple Keynesian closure for the old model, or the neo-Marxist closure for the model, basically it was a zero-sum game. So that, and only when you introduce the possibility that you might have a change in capacity utilization, do you get possibilities of both sides winning and possibilities that both sides are losing. And so I'm curious whether you've made your model sufficiently classical so that you really, in your long run equilibrium, do you essentially have full capacity utilization?
Yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay.
The model is fully classical. It operates at full capacity all the time. The win-win feature that we have in the model is that technical change is distribution driven, which is also classical.
Yes. Well,
so you have a so the win-win feature, the wage-led growth in the long run, arises because of the distributional features of technical change, not because of adjusting capacity utilization. The adjustment of capacity utilization, if you want to call it like that, which is not, it's the output capital rationer model. It happens through what Tom has labeled Marx bias technical change. capital using labor saving. This happens along the transitional dynamics. It's very similar to the solo model, but it operates through technical change and not factor substitution along a given production function.
I think theoretically your work is even more interesting then, because I think at one point, many of us would have thought that without changes, without some variability in capacity utilization in equilibrium, then you only get zero-sum outcomes. And what you basically demonstrated is, no, you can get non-zero-sum outcomes, due to an entirely different dynamic. And I just find that incredibly interesting.
Well, thank you for saying that. As I said, this has been a pet peeve of mine for the last 12, 13 years. So I'm glad that somebody's noticing.
Can I just add one thing, which is just to clarify my thinking about the world? I don't know if I'm not speaking for Daniela, but I really think the world is Keynesian in the short run and classical in the long run. So these neo-Kaleckian models to me are very interesting and important, but I don't think that they really describe the long-term, behavior of the capitalist economy. So I'm actually, I consider myself, with a foot in both camps in a sense because of that. I don't know if that helps clarify what we're trying to do in the paper, Robin, but.
No, it does. That's very helpful.
Okay, great. Do any of the other attendees have any questions? If you want to raise your hand, I can. Okay, Mark Setterfield, so I can allow you to talk, and you should be able to do so now.
Thanks, Josh. This is a great paper, and I really enjoyed the presentation of it, Tom. I realize now I was talking to Daniela yesterday about a different matter, and I've been thinking about some of these issues myself, and I'm thinking now that a lot of what I've been thinking about is reinventing the wheel here that you pretty much presented in your structural model. One little wrinkle, though, that I want to call to attention, and I don't know if you've thought about this, is that your Kaldor-Verdun effect depends on a capital to population ratio. So I think I'm trying to figure out exactly how that differs from a regular Kaldor mechanism where you get a boost to labor productivity growth simply as a result of faster growth per se, which in your model would just come from a faster rate of accumulation. And in particular, there is a kind of post-66 Kaldor literature on this endogeneity of the natural rate, which also looks to solve this first Harrod problem, in which the idea is that a tighter labor market indicative of a tighter overall economy actually kind of boosts the Kaldor-Verdun effect, which is not as operative in a slacker economy as indicated, for example, by a lower employment rate. And I'm just trying to figure out on the fly here if your capital to population ratio variable is consistent with that idea or not. So since I'm trying to figure it out on the fly, I thought I'd raise it as a question and see if you can help me out with that.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Well, we got this from the Taylor-Foley-Rezai paper. And, the idea is that the capital population ratio is kind of a scale factor. And basically their equation is a reduced form. So it's not rigorously micro-founded, but as you point out, I mean, you can point to literature that does kind of, give a rationale for it. I think, the capital population ratio would be correlated with the employment rate. So it would probably pick up some of what you're talking about, but it wouldn't pick up this idea that tight labor markets are, I don't think, are some kind of non-linearity in the Verdun relation. I don't think it would pick that up. It's an interesting point. Actually,
I think this is a very good point, Mark. And the correlation. So the K over N, if you have a Leontief production function, right? K over N is basically equal to employment up to the output capital ratio. Yes.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's what Tom was saying. So the mechanism is there, even though the output capital ratio is endogenous, right, and path dependent.
Right. Yeah.
So that's something to dig into a little more, probably.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm going to have a look into this because I think what that ratio approach is very interesting. A few years ago, I tried to have work with an endogenous Verdun coefficient, which was kind of a bit of a clunky way of doing it because it just makes it mischievously nonlinear. And also, my equation was continuous, whereas I think what Tom picked up on is the right idea, that it's really trying to proxy a kind of discontinuous effect, that you get more of a Verdun fillip to technical change in a tight economy than in a slack economy, but not necessarily on a kind of continuous sliding scale. So, well, anyway, I don't want to monopolize the time. It's interesting stuff, and we're in the weeds right now, but I think this is worth digging into a bit further.
Okay, great. Any other questions from any other attendees? Can raise their hand if they have any. It seems like not. Okay, so I will make the last presentation here then. Let me share my screen with all of you here. Okay. All right, so thank you. My paper is called The Precariat Class and the COVID-19 Crisis. Joshua Greenstein, as you know. So basically, this is an ongoing work that I'm going to be presenting here. The Precariat Class, I'll explain what that means more a little bit momentarily, but the basic idea is I'm using a class system proposed by the development economist Guy Standing, where he's kind of making a distinction between sort of traditional working class and a newer working class, maybe, which he calls the precariat, which is more having to do with temporary employment, part-time, unstable, benefit-free, sort of lower quality jobs. And so I have recently, last year, published a paper using this system, applying it to the US in the review of radical political economy, which I'm going to mention in a minute. And so what I'm doing here is kind of trying to update that research and taking into account the COVID-19 crisis and sort of how that's playing out. These forces are interacting with each other. Of course, when I started this project, 6 or 7 months ago, I was hoping that at this point I would be talking about the crisis in the past tense. So I think, as Tom and Daniela mentioned, what this is actually going to look like when we get to the final is still to be determined, I think. Okay, so real quickly here, this is just some things about declining quality of U.S. jobs over the last several decades. There's this sort of general trend of declining quality of jobs, and measured not just by pay, but by benefits and other working conditions. And specifically what I want to highlight is this particular type of decline, which has to do with, as you see in the second bullet point here, which I kind of already mentioned, increased temporary or part-time employment, outsourced or contract employment, this fissured workplace is David Wells' idea there. And there's some debate. A gig economy is maybe another thing you might hear about, as sort of one manifestation of that. It doesn't mean only that, obviously. It also means like temp work, adjunct faculty is the equivalent for academia, these kind of things, right? So there's a little bit of a dispute about how much of a trend this actually is, these kinds of sort of part-time or self-employment work. It kind of depends on how you measure it, how you define it, and things like that, which is what I'm just sort of acknowledging in this last bullet point. Okay, so this is the paper I mentioned earlier that I published last year in Review of Radical Political Economy, where I took this precariat class structure, which is based on this kind of changing kind of work. I'm going to describe it more in the next slide. And I tried to take these definitions that originally were developed by Guy Standing, the development economist, and apply to sort of to data in the US and see what I could tell by sort of trying to a little bit more rigorously define these in sort of data terms using BLS data, and see what I could say about what this structure can tell us about the US. So here's on the right here is what Standing's system looks like. And again, like in his work, he's kind of describing it in words. And so I'm trying to, in this paper, this older paper, I tried to sort of define it using BLS data and then apply it to the US so I could track some trends and see what it could tell us about income inequality, about other traits of these classes and stuff. So I'm going to quickly go through this list on the right here and just tell you a little bit about what they mean and then about how I sort of made this into data to work empirically, right? So the first one there is the Precariat Class. Is kind of, maybe you could think of this the 1% if you want to use that term, or maybe like a capitalist class, right? These are like the highest earners. Maybe a significant portion of their income comes from non-labor sources. So to operationalize that in the data, I put people in that class if, again, they're among the very highest percentile of earners, and if a significant portion of their income comes from sources such as interest or dividends and non-labor income. Salariate and proficient. So these next four in a row, the salariate, proficient, core working class, and precariat, kind of those go together. So the salariate and proficient can kind of be thought of as a pair, and the core working class and precariat can be thought of as a pair, right? And so this is where Standing made this split based on the sort of more stable work or temporary part-time, et cetera work, right? So the salariate, you can think of that as like a sort of professional class, right? This is, college jobs that require a college education, probably office type jobs, right? Paid by salary, not hourly wage. And for the salariate, that would also mean that there is stable employment, full-time, probably have benefits from their job, et cetera, right? So the proficient is the version of that that's become more precarized, if you want to use that word, whatever the proper way of phrasing that is. So the proficient would be, it's a job that requires a college education, probably still like an office type job, but the one that's now in this category of unstable work, part-time work, self-employed, things like that. So you can think of like contract workers, temp workers, again, the adjuncts when we're talking about academia, right? And so then the core working class and precariat follows a similar relationship between the salariate and proficient, right? Where these are jobs that typically don't require a college education, right? This is how I operationalize this in the data. But the core working class are the ones that are full-time, stable employment, have some sort of benefits with their job, right? And the precariat, I put people into that category if they had the same kind of jobs that didn't require a college education typically, but were either self-employed, part-time, extended periods of unemployment, lack of benefits at their job, unstable hours, these kind of things that you can get from the BLS data. The last one, unemployed, detached, those are actually two different categories in Standing, but for my purposes, I put them together in one. And this is like sort of long-term unemployed. It can both mean that unemployed means long-term unemployed, right? So Standing's idea is that if you don't have a job for a really long time, you're eventually sort of more defined in this class structure by the lack of a job than whatever your job used to be. And detached is maybe the even more extreme version of that, homelessness, things like that. Yeah. Okay, so I took this, I tried to define it using BLS data. This is the old paper, and then I just sort of tried to look at some trends and things like that. So here's like the percentages for the years that I looked at of people that ended up in each of these categories. The main one I want to mention here for this paper is just these changes, right? So this is a core working class and precariat there, right? And so the trend there from 1980 to 2018, when I made these categories, was that the precariat was growing in percentage over this time, and the core working class was precipitously declining, right? So what does that mean practically? It means more people in jobs without a college, that don't typically require a college education, were in these circumstances that we described, of part-time, unstable work, et cetera. Yeah. Or lack of benefits is a big driver of this as well. And then I also looked at some things like race. So here's like the percent Black and percent Hispanic in core working class and precariat. So you see like a Hispanic in particular is really disproportionately in precariat. Gender was interesting. So here, this is male and female for core working class and precariat. So you see that they're both, more than half men, but core working class, the 60% there was really disproportionately male compared to precariat, which was about 50-50 male and female, close to it anyway. Yeah. So this is I did more things in this paper as well, but I don't want to spend the whole time talking about the old paper. But this is just a sort of idea of the kind of things that I looked at. Yep. Okay. So what I wanted to do was combine that with some of the other things that we're seeing related to COVID and the inequality of this crisis in terms of job and income losses and safe work, right? So this is male and female unemployment since the onset of the crisis, basically. And the main thing I want to draw your attention to here is, looking at March in 2020, that initial burst of unemployment, you see actually higher unemployment rate for women than men. That's not typical. It's not what it looked like, for example, in the Great Recession, financial crisis crash, where you had an initial big up spike in unemployment by men first, and then women came later. This might have something to do with the nature of the jobs that men and women have, sort of employment, labor market segmentation thing. It also might have probably does have something to do with the childcare, school closure kind of aspect of this crisis, right? But either way, the point here I just want to emphasize is this big difference in unemployment for men and women. This is income loss by race during the crisis. This is from last fall. And so again, you just see that experienced or expected income loss for Latino or Black respondents was much higher than for white. So these are all examples. There's a million pieces of research about, impacts by race and gender and things like that. I'm just showing you a couple examples to sort of make the point. Yeah. This one is interesting as well. This is about the employment by hourly wage tercile, right? So you see the lowest income earners had the biggest drop in employment at the beginning of the crisis, and it recovered less quickly as well. If you look at the farther part of the graph there. This is that same graph on the bottom right, comparing it to previous recessions. So you see this is atypical, right? How big of a difference there is between the job losses by low income earners and higher income earners. I have a bunch here. I'm not going to go through each one. Immigrants have faced deeper job cuts. Young adults did worse. Non-college educated done worse, et cetera, right? So the main point I want to get at here is that the people who have lost jobs, when you look at who has lost jobs and who has lost income during the COVID-19 crisis, there are major differences between groups, by things like race, gender, education level, et cetera, number one. And number two, that those patterns in many cases look different than they have looked in previous quote unquote normal recessions. Yeah. Okay, so the other aspect of job-related inequality I want to talk about has to do with working in riskier conditions. So you also see a lot of inequality there. This is definitely still an issue now. I think it was probably even more of an issue at the start of the first several months of the crisis, first 6 months, let's say, before vaccines were widely available. But throughout the crisis, including now, you see big differences in who gets to work from home, who has to go to work in risky conditions, who is therefore putting their health at risk and putting themselves at risk of infection. As with the previous example, you see differences in here by job type, sector, race, gender, age, all things that might be correlated to these class categories. So again, just a couple examples of this. This is a survey from very early in the crisis about whether or not you have been able to work from home. If you look over to the left here, I have these arrows. So all adults, again, this is very early in the crisis, March 2020. But if you look at all adults, 40% were saying they could work from home. But then if you look at it broken down by education level, right? Huge, massive differences in education level, right? Where post-grad, 73% were saying that, bachelor 62, high school or less 22. And then by income as well, right? Lower income, much more likely to say they're able to work from home than higher income. So another example here, again, there's a million examples you could find of this stuff. I'm just giving a few here. Lower levels of education, more likely to not be working because they are sick. This is with coronavirus symptoms. This is from last fall. So you again see a very high correlation between someone saying they couldn't work because of illness, similar to coronavirus, by a level of education. Essential workers, disproportionately female. You see that here, and this is all different jobs that are considered essential workers, and many of them are disproportionately female. This is another example of how they're disproportionately female, disproportionately Black as well here, right? So again, what's the main point here? Again, just that a lot of these groups that might be related to or correlated with these kind of class categories that I mentioned in the first part of the presentation are experiencing different impacts of the crisis in terms of lost jobs and incomes, and also ability to work safely. Yeah. So getting now in the last sort of third of the presentation, I want to talk about what I'm working on now, which is trying to tie those two things together, right? Trying to look at this class system, look at this idea that, you know, different groups are affected differently by the coronavirus crisis, and seeing how I can sort of tie these two things together. Yeah. So what I want to do is track some different categories through the last year and a half or so, using these different class categories. So this is the data that I used to do that, the annual social and economic supplement of the current population survey 2019. This is the annual one. This is what I used in the previous paper as well, was the ASEC surveys to create the class categories using data. The other thing that I've used is the current population survey, the monthly one from the BLS, right, which tracks different sort of employment statistics by month to month. So the one complication that I had here, which is what I've spent a lot of my my sort of data part of the work trying to figure out, is that the basic monthly population survey didn't have all of the data that I needed to create the class categories, right? So the annual supplement has a lot more data in it, has a lot more questions, and a lot of the information that I was using to put people into those categories was only available in the annual survey, right? Things like income, what type of benefits their jobs had, etc. Yeah, but I didn't want to just look at it, 2019, 2020, 2021, 3 surveys, with a year in between each one, because the whole point of this was I kind of wanted to track what was happening to people over the course of the crisis, right? So I needed the monthly surveys for that, in which I used, about 15 months worth of monthly surveys. So what I did was I used an imputation process to impute the class categories from that I calculated in the annual social and economic supplement to the basic monthly population survey. So I'll explain a little bit more about what I did for that. So I used this process called multinomial logistic regression, right? And so the way this worked is, what I did is I had, the annual survey, in which I could calculate the class categories, and then I had these monthly surveys where I couldn't do that, right? So what I did was identified these variables, the variables listed here. Now, what the reason for these variables is, these variables listed are in both types of surveys, right? So they were in the annual one, and they were also in the monthly ones. And they're also all highly correlated with the class status, right? So what this process does is, it uses these variables that are existing in both to predict the class where each individual would have been assigned in the class for the monthly surveys. Yeah. So things like age, race, gender, citizenship status, education level, marital status, region of country, metropolitan status. These were available in both types of surveys, and they are all highly correlated with class, right? So through this imputation process, you give, I did this in Stata software. So you tell it to use the data set where you have the class to draw relationships between these variables and the class variable, and then you use it to sort of assign what you think people would be in based on these variables. Okay. So then once I did that, I just traced things in the monthly surveys of things like job loss and duration of unemployment and things like that, to try to trace these different outcomes for people in the different classes over the course of the crisis. And I'm going to just give you a couple examples of that now. Again, this ongoing process, I'm going to show you a couple things and talk about, you know, what I'm trying to look into here. So for example, this is working part-time. And I have in there the percentage of workers who were working part-time through from May to September 21. I have it for the Precariat is in the blue, the core working class in purple, and all in this sort of dark blue. So what's the point here? One thing we see, obviously, Precariat workers are much more likely to be working part-time. This is expected. Yeah, but the difference between that and core working class is really big. And remember, this is the group that's getting bigger. The other perhaps interesting thing here is, you know, this part here where in the increase, it seems like not only that not only is the Precariat more likely to be working part-time, but that the jumps are bigger, right? Like the gap is getting bigger in these sort of crisis terms. Yeah. The next couple of slides I want to look at are about job loss and gain. So this one is reason for unemployment in last week is job loss, right? So one of the questions on the survey is, are you employed or unemployed? If you say unemployed, their next question is, you know, why do you not have a job? And there are several different answers that added together all have to do with job loss. Okay, so this is core working class and Precariat. It's all a very similar pattern, obviously, right? But the places that I want to focus on are where they're separate, and then talk a little bit about why that might be. So if you look at where they're separate, right? So here at the beginning, right, you see the Precariat is higher for answering that they lost job. Again, here, in late winter of 2020, midwinter, I should say, and then again here in late spring of 21. So if you look at these times, these are the times when you had high job loss, like sort of crisis periods, right? So it's that initial outbreak, that first circle there. The second one there, December 20, is kind of right going into the big winter surge that we had last year. And then that third one is going into the Delta surge that we had beginning in late spring and into the summer, right? So my idea here is that while they catch up eventually, it looks like maybe when you have those initial periods of job loss, these are the times where the Precariat class are losing their job first. Yeah, they're the first one to lose their jobs. I should say also, this is true of the next couple of graphs as well. Although these spaces look really small, but everything's statistically significant, everything, because they're really, really high number of observations. These are tens of thousands of individuals. And then with the survey weights, it's representing hundreds of thousands of people. So even when you see these sort of small, consistent differences it's still a meaningful or statistically significant difference. So this one is the other side of it now. This is consecutive weeks currently unemployed, right? So this one, they ask you, if you're unemployed, how many weeks have you been unemployed, right? So when that's going up, it means more people that are unemployed have been unemployed for a long time. When this number is going down, it means people are getting hired again, right? So again, it mostly follows the same pattern, but again, there are some points where it diverges, right? So during this sort of crisis and recovery time, it seems like core working class was going up while the Precariat was already falling down. Yeah, the duration of unemployment. And again here, this is last spring, I should say, before the summer, when this was a big job growth period, right? And it seems like the duration of unemployment, the blue one here is Precariat, was dropping first. So this is indicating that members of Precariat were getting hired first, right? So I think where I'm kind of going with this, and where I think I want to go next, is this sort of churn idea, right? That there seems to be some indication that the Precariat class were the ones to be fired first, but also might have been hired back first as well during these sort of upturn times, yeah. And this is just that one. Those were for comparing the Precariat to core working class, and this is just comparing it to the whole sample, but you see the same thing, right? That in the same time periods, it's dropping, the duration of unemployment is dropping for Precariat, while it's still remaining a little bit higher for everyone else as a whole. Okay, last bit, sorry, I'm going a little long here, but last bit I just want to mention, this is related back to this work safety idea, right? So this is one of the questions I asked, were you ever paid for remote work due to COVID in the last week? Yeah. And so this one you see, as we would expect, and as we've seen in other research, massive difference between the jobs that require a college education and the ones that don't, right? So the top one are the two categories that are jobs that require a college education, the bottom ones or don't. So it's obviously, it's sort of downward sloping for everyone, but huge difference between whether which one of those two categories you're in terms of whether you were paid to do remote work. But then if we just focus in on the non-college education requiring jobs, you still see this difference, right? Where it's small, but consistently apart throughout the whole time, that core working class workers were more likely to be paid for remote work than the precariat class, right? And so again, remember the context of all of this is the previous research that shows precariat class growing and core working class shrinking over the last several decades by these definitions, right? Okay, so what do I want to keep looking into here, right? So I've kind of mentioned these a little bit. The first one is about this sort of churn idea, right? Of first out, first rehired, though maybe two, right? That the people who have these kind of temporary or part-time jobs are more get fired first, but then might get rehired again more quickly. The more likely to be part-time, and then finally these differences in whether you're allowed to work from home or even able to work from home, depending on your job. All right, so that's where I'm at now. And again, this is sort of an ongoing work, both related to sort of where I am and also to where the crisis is. So that's it. Thank you very much. I guess since I'm also the chair, I'll see now if anybody has any questions or comments for me.
Ross, I got a question.
Sure.
I mean, first of all, I'm always so happy when the farther we get away from this is the capitalist class and the working class, the happier I am. I was very happy when the Ehrenreich said there's this thing called the professional managerial class. I thought Eric Olin Wright's work, was really, really important in saying, oh, there are so many important differences. So I appreciate, and you've introduced sort of a new element, which is, I mean, your salary at and your proficient is sort of taking what you might call the upper echelon of the professional managerial class and saying there really is sort of two parts to that. One is sort of much more stable and the other is much less stable. And then you've done the same thing, in terms of the working class, and distinguishing the sort of traditional working class and the precariat. So I think that's really helpful. One question I have is that in the popular press, they have this phrase called the Great Resignation, and that implies that people are voluntarily not working. And I keep wondering whether that is a true story or an untrue story. And it seems to me that your work is suggesting that, well, that's not really what's going on. It's really not a question of being voluntary or not voluntary. But I mean, there is an underlying question, which is there a degree to which people in really bad, low-paying jobs are just saying, screw it, I'm just not going to do that anymore, particularly if it means going and potentially getting sick? Is it that they can't work from home? That there's a huge difference in terms of which of these groups of people in the labor market can work from home or not? And then the whole notion of essential workers, that some people are being told, you actually, I'm thinking of nurses, where you actually have to come to work, you are an essential worker, and only when you get totally discouraged and worn out do you just quit. So I'm wondering if you could sort of comment on those things. That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, great question. So first of all, just to clarify, I mean, the whole salariate, proficient, and core working class precariat, I did, that's not my original idea. I wish I could claim it. It's based on a system developed by this development economist guy Standing. What I'm doing that to my knowledge hasn't been done before is trying to sort of really apply that to US data and sort of then taking this sort of empirical, like sort of tracking and analysis. But I agree, it's interesting, which is why, you know, I chose to try to do that. So as far, yeah, I mean, I think it's such a great question with this mass resignation, and I certainly don't have a clear answer to it, but I think it's something that gonna need to address in this. But you know, I think you're right that this is just my sense, I guess, my opinion, that some of that is voluntary for precisely the reasons that you're talking about. You know, that maybe this is a if I'm going to frame it in these terms, maybe there's a sort of negative effect for the capitalist class that they didn't quite anticipate, of making all of these jobs temporary and part-time and unstable, right? Which is that when you're not having this stable job that you're trying to hold on to for years to come, and then you know that next year it's going to be something different, or it's only part-time anyway, or et cetera, maybe it's easier to avoid that for a couple months when it seems dangerous. Yeah, this is just speculation, but I think it's speculating along the same lines that you are, that it's a really interesting question. And I think that's definitely something that I need to look at more as I move forward with this. So thank you. Tom, you had a question as well?
Yes, I was thinking as you presented that very interesting set of slides, that there's an intersection here with the old idea that we have segmented labor markets. And actually, I was thinking about something that Lance Taylor has argued, which is that we're undergoing a process of a kind of, he calls it a reverse Lewis development, where, you know, instead of drawing workers out of some kind of reserve army or something, we're actually building up this sort of backward sector and deindustrializing the, you know, it's just kind of a resegmentation. And I'm wondering if that can sort of intersect with your you know, class structure. And from a practical standpoint, I was thinking with your imputations, whether industry, I mean, do you have data on where they work, right? That might be a way of, you know, fine tuning that, because I think what we're looking at is, you know, these are just forms of the reserve army of labor. And the fact that it's enlarging in the US and other advanced countries is significant to me from the point of view of growth theory, since I, you know, really believe that that's one of the reasons why labor constraints are not so binding as in conventional theory. So I was very interested in your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, first of all, that idea of the reverse Lewis process, I really like that way of framing it, and I think that's absolutely the idea of what's, you know, supposed to be happening with this precariat, right? I mean, it may be not exactly the same as like a reserve army of labor in the traditional sense, right? Where you think that would be more, almost fits more like the long-term unemployed or something like that, is how I usually think of it anyway. But it's some kind of similar idea, right? Of just being able to take someone's labor when you need it and then discard it when you don't need it, right? This is the idea, right? And there's all, you know, even like the most extreme version of that is like you have these, like, you know, gig work websites where it's like you can literally hire someone for, you know, $1 an hour, it comes out to like, you know, look through some pictures and say, do I see a cat in this or something? And it's for some study or for some optimizing Google's web search or something. And it is these websites where literally people just go on there and make like a couple dollars over an hour and then they're done. You know, like this is the most extreme, right? But I mean, I think that's, but yeah, I mean, it's a similar idea. So I like that. Yeah. As far as the imputation, right, with the occupation. So the reason why I didn't do that is because the occupation type went into the original assignment to what class they were in, right? So I identified occupations by, so I'm sorry, but when I'm in like the annual one, actually assigning the classes, BLS classifies occupations by typical level of education needed. Yeah, and so I used that to determine which, to help as one of the things to determine which class people should be in. So if you had a job that, for example, typically requires a college education, you're going to be in one of the top two. If it's typically high school, you would be in one of the lower two, for example, right? So I use the occupation for that to create the class categories. So I didn't use that for the imputation because the idea is that for the imputation, I need to use variables that are correlated with class, but not directly used to calculate it, right? Okay. Any other questions? Let's see. All right, it seems like not. So,
Josh,
oh, you did have
Yeah,
one. Yes, go ahead. Great.
I wanted to wait and see if there was somebody else, but if there isn't, I do have another question. So I'm just curious whether I intuitively like your distinction between your salary, the salariate and proficient, and then again your distinction between core working class and precariat. What I'm wondering is, if you control for race and gender, how much of that difference disappears? And it sounded like you actually had already, I was just having trouble following it, quickly online. From some of what you presented, it looked like, well, you actually are looking into that because you're looking at differences, by gender and by race. But one whole question would be, how much does your categorization actually stand up against the test that says, but if we control for those two things, we basically don't have any, these distinctions disappear? That's the question.
Yeah, great.
They don't.
Right. Okay, thank you. Yeah, great question. Great question. So, so what I think what you're talking about as far as looking at it already, what I briefly showed at the beginning in my previous paper that I looked at sort of how race and gender break down in these class structures. And especially when you're looking at, which is sort of the main thing I am looking at, the differences between precariat and core working class. Precariat is really disproportionately female compared to the core working class, right? So if you remember, I looked at that one, it was, when you looked at when you looked at precariat, it was almost 50-50 male and female. I think it was 52 male, 48% female. And the core working class was like 60-40. 60% male, 40% female, right? So, yeah, great question. And I think you're right that I should sort of think of some way to control for that and make sure that it's not totally driven by that. But, I think that when you're talking about labor market segmentation, that's always a little bit of a chicken and egg type argument, right? And by which I mean, are jobs disproportionately female because they're poor quality jobs, or do jobs become poor quality because they're disproportionately female? I'm not sure if I phrased that clearly. Let me try it again. There's two different ways of thinking about it, right? Which is that women are pushed towards lower quality jobs. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is that jobs become more poorly treated, more lower quality because they're disproportionately female, right? So in a way, this is sort of the same question that you're asking here, right? So let's say we see that the precariat is disproportionately female. Okay, so why? Is that because of the type of jobs or because they're female, right? But it's a good question, and I do agree that I should do something, maybe compare the same categories by just looking at males and females without looking at the classes to see if it's totally driven by that. And I think it's a worthwhile point there. Yeah.
But there was an old example of this was back in the days of the Soviet Union. Medical doctors in the Soviet Union were primarily female. And at the same time, medical doctors in the United States were primarily male. And in the United States, medical doctors' relative salaries were much, much higher than others. Whereas, in the Soviet Union, guess what? Medical doctors don't get paid that much more than anybody else. So that's an example of how it can be driven by simply that factor. But yeah, and it is a chicken and an egg dilemma. Absolutely.
Yeah, there definitely are also studies that show sort of, jobs that have changed over time, whether they're more male or more female, and changing status of those jobs as well. But again, that example that you just gave is interesting because it's clearly there's a clear answer there. But with jobs changing over time, it's sort of the same question, right? Did the quality of the job change, or did the gender component change? It looks like we have one attendee, Matthew, who wants to ask a question as well. So that's great. So let me, where'd he go? Did you not want to anymore? You do, okay. Let me allow you to talk there. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
You can hear me now?
I can.
Yeah, I just thought in that vein, because it was something that we investigated a little bit in one of my classes with the presenter who is not here today, Josh Mason, it might be interesting to look at, the members of the Precariat. Are sometimes women members of the Precariat due to concerns about childcare versus, being in the Precariat because they are women? And if it's possible to break out what members of the Precariat who are losing hours might be doing so because they need to care for children whose school might not be in person at a given moment.
Yeah, great question. And and that also again is a question that's going to come up a lot in sort of labor market when you look at labor market segmentation jobs that are disproportionately women. There's also that sort of a choice aspect, right? Of maybe, and I think that question is always going to be relevant when you look at part-time or temporary work and gender. But I think, as you mentioned, Matthew, it's even more relevant now with the COVID crisis. Right? I took out a slide that I had before because I think it was enough. But there's also studies that are really laying a lot of the change on male and female unemployment differences on issues related to childcare and school closures during COVID, right? Because as I think you're alluding to here, right? Like a school closes, or a daycare closes, or a kid has to be homeschooled for several months. That burden has disproportionately fallen on women, and that might lead them to dropping out of the labor force, not re-entering the labor force when they might have under other circumstances, or make them more likely to want to take part-time jobs and things like that. So yeah, I agree. I don't have the answer to that question, and it's in a way it's related to Robin's original question as well about how to sort of figure out how much of this is voluntary and how much of it is involuntary, right? Although whether to frame this particular one, right, if you're talking about women leaving the workforce because of the childcare crisis that we're having, it's a little bit unclear whether we should consider that voluntary or involuntary. But from one very specific perspective, it's involuntary in the sense that they might not be being fired or something, right? It's voluntary. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question as well. Yeah. All right. Anyone else? All right. So, I mean, I guess maybe we have 10 minutes, not that we have to take the whole time, but maybe I'll just, before we all log out, just see if anyone has any questions they thought of for the other two presenters in the time since they presented. Give one more chance here. Okay. And it seems like not. All right, so great. Well, I guess we only had till 2:15. It's 2:06, so we're mostly there. So I guess maybe call it a day there then. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for the great questions I got. I really enjoyed getting those questions. Thanks to Tom and Robin for your great presentations.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you. Goodbye.